Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, the House entertains this matter of shrinking our legislature. Now, you have to say the people of Pennsylvania overwhelmingly support that. But there are those that still staunchly oppose it, as we just heard some clapping there. And we voted for this several times now, and I just want to lay out some of the arguments in favor of shrinking the legislature. It's important to examine this subject objectively. Just remember, PA, Pennsylvania, operates the largest full-time legislature in the United States. The only legislature bigger than ours is New Hampshire with 424, and it's a part-time legislature. That should be enough. That statement alone should be enough to persuade you, because that statement is ringing in the ears of our constituents back home. There are too many politicians in Harrisburg. That's what you hear. Way too many politicians. Now, I've taken the opportunity over the last 4 years to visit 14 state legislatures and to study how their systems work. And I think it's through the lens of comparison that we can see clearly the blemishes of our own system. So let's take a look at just a few of the other legislatures around us. Let's look at our neighbor, Ohio, which is nearly equivalent in population and size to Pennsylvania, very close. And it governs with a 99-member state house. 99 members. Roughly 120,000 residents per representative. So a smaller legislature is not impossible for a state our size. I visited that legislature and observed how it functioned. And I can tell you, on the floor of their house, there's much less chaos and much more robust actual debate on the floor. Not like here. Most people aren't even listening right now. Most people come, when you bring your constituents up here, when you bring your constituents up here, the first thing they notice is the chaos, right? But in Ohio, when you look at Ohio, they actually listen to the debate. Go to Ohio. Now, I'm trying to compare Ohio to Pennsylvania. We can learn from looking at other states. And Ohio has a lot of tolerance.
Ladies and gentlemen, the House will come to order, please. Ladies and gentlemen.
You're making my point. I love it. Thank you for making my point.
Would you suspend a moment, please? Would you suspend, sir, for a moment?
Yes, madam.
Ladies and gentlemen, the House will come to order. We are paying close attention. We let people have a little bit of leeway, but we never get too rowdy, do we? Of course not. Thank you.
And Madam
you may
Speaker,
continue, Mr.
I would never be accused of ever getting rowdy. So. I'd also like to take a look at the state of Illinois, the 5th largest in population, just ahead of us, and just slightly larger in size. It also functioned very effectively with 118 representatives. You may remember, I invited one of the state senators from Illinois here to be with us on the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address just last year. He happens to occupy Abraham Lincoln's seat. And I was able to discuss with him and other legislators in Illinois how they function with a much smaller legislature. And then there's New York, 3rd largest in population and slightly larger than us in size. They operate their house with 150 representatives. Now, I heard it argued here, one of the arguments against this proposal is from our rural districts. Our rural colleagues say that a smaller legislature will hurt the rural districts. And for that, I would offer the example of Montana. Montana is the 4th largest state geographically, and has a really good example of the rural-urban mix. Over 147,000 square miles, just under 1 million people in 56 counties, and a quarter of their population is in 4 cities. And they function effectively with 100 state representatives and 50 senators. I visited that legislature, and I talked with senators and reps there. And they feel that Montana is well represented. Their rural-urban split is well represented with only 100 state representatives. Other colleagues contend that Pennsylvania is a diverse state, and we are. But it's interesting that when you talk to representatives in other states, they also argue that their state is uniquely diverse. Ohio, as we said, is a rural state with concentrated populations in two large cities, such as Cleveland and Cincinnati. Illinois is a rural state with a large concentration in Chicago and surrounding counties. Yet both operate effectively with a smaller legislature. Now, some colleagues say, actually, believe it or not, some colleagues say we should have a larger legislature. The larger, the better. Voice of the people. We need more legislators. But when you look at the example of the only legislature larger than ours, New Hampshire, 424 members, you see what happens is the voice of the people is so small that each individual legislator is neutered. And the leadership carries most of the weight. And individual legislators don't have much say. Others argue that a larger legislature cuts down on corruption, as it's difficult for lobbyists to influence a larger number of legislators. We heard that kind of from our colleague from Delaware County. In fact, a larger assembly places the power in the hands of a few leaders, so lobbyists need only influence those leaders to get their way. Finally, at least a few colleagues tout the fact that the number we represent currently, around 63,000, is small enough that we can personally touch each one, each constituent. And I agree. As my good colleague from Delaware County noted, I've knocked on nearly 40,000 doors in the last several elections. My wife and I routinely attend over 200 events in our district, as many of you probably do too. But under this bill, our districts will become only slightly larger and will remain a size still reachable by a representative that's willing to work at it. We will not forfeit our accessibility by shrinking the legislature. As we said, there's nothing magical about that number 203. It was arrived at arbitrarily. What we can safely say is that there's an effective number for a state our size and our population, and that number is somewhere between 100 and 175. We can learn from Ohio, we can learn from New York, we can learn from Illinois, we can learn from these other states, but we don't have to be them. I understand that. We can set our own standard within those guidelines. And that makes the proposed number of 151 a reasonable number for a state our size and with our population. And still others argue that not much money will be saved, and that's relatively true. We'll likely save maybe in the tens of millions, not the hundreds of millions. It's not that big of a savings. But the larger argument is about effectiveness of government, not just cost savings. Some argue that it's not the legislature that needs shrunk, it's the bureaucracy. Well, that's true also, but it's not an either-or argument. We can shrink both. Some people say we should start with the legislature, we should start at the top, and we should eventually work on shrinking state government overall. But we need to reduce our legislature. In the end, the people desire a smaller legislature, and there's sound justification that our legislature is just too large. Remember, this legislation has to pass both House and Senate twice in 2 sessions before it goes to the people in a referendum where they can ultimately decide. The people want this, but they don't believe we'll do it. I always hear back home, well, they say, you'll never vote yourselves out of a job. You politicians, you'll never vote yourself out of a job. But the truth is, in the House, we have. This is going to be the 3rd time now that most of us are going to vote ourselves right out of a job. So we've shown we will do that, and I think that's a good thing. It's time we do what the people want, do the right thing, vote yes on House Bill 153. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.